Hey y'all, as y'all know, I only make videos when I feel like I'm moved to talk to something, to a situation. No new situation has happened that I feel like I need to speak about. Actually, a few, and I will probably do videos on those later. But this situation I want to speak about is actually something that's been resting on my chest for some time now, actually over a year. Um, as most black people know, we have not been taught our history, right? We've been taught history, the histories of America, the history of white people, the history of many other cultures, and we've been taught the history of slavery, which is the history of white people. But we haven't been taught our history, right? And so what happens is, as with me, you get to a certain age and you get curious and you want to know what that history is, and you begin to search for it, as did I. And as on my journey, I found that not only was I not taught my history, but I was lied to about my history. And I found that white people were also not taught the history, and white people were also lied to about the history. See, all people, black, white, and all races in between, are victims of the imperialization and the colonization of the earth that happened by ancient Europeans. Okay? And the effects of that are trickling into this world today. So I thought that I'd do a service, as it is my duty, to enlighten the people. And so this video, normally my videos are usually for my people and here for anyone else to listen. This video is for all people. Okay, so I'll start with the fact that I am not a racist. I don't hate any other racial group. The topics that we're going into are going to be very touchy and very difficult. If you don't have the maturity level to take in new information with an open mind and do your own research, then maybe this video is not for you. Okay? So, that being said, I started with the question, why and how did black people come to America? Because for me, the math was just a little bit off, right? It was a little hard for me to understand how the world got populated with black people through the slave trade, right? And the reason why it was hard for me to understand is because the world is populated with black people, and supposedly all of these black people came and populated the world on boats. And I honestly can't see how a boat from the 1800s would be able to populate America with the amount of black people that are there, let alone the world. So I did some research, and I found that the majority of the black people around the world were there already, and white people, or sorry, not white people, European people, came, and outsiders, Muslims, Europeans, they came in and began to enslave people from Africa and transport them to places where Africans already existed. Now, the Africans that were brought in were slaves. The Africans that were not brought in were not slaves, but they were treated like second-class citizens. Some, through misidentity, were enslaved, but the slave population was a very small population of African Americans around the world, and they were a workforce, meaning that there were the black people that worked as slaves and they were easily identified, and then the black people who weren't, who were walking around normally. It's very similar to the Yiddish invasion of the Middle East, where the Jewish people and the Jews are easily distinguishable just by, you can look at them and tell the difference between the two peoples. So, but that's another conversation altogether. The point is that black people were not placed around the world by white people through slavery. Europeans were not the distributor of African bloodline throughout the world. African bloodline existed on every continent throughout the world. It was the dominant bloodline on every continent throughout the world. And if you research the original peoples of any land that you find, you will find that the original peoples were all African people or people of African descent. We're talking about Chinese, Japanese, Australian, you name it. Any peoples who you look up, the original natives of that land are Africans. So I just wanted to dispel that myth. There are more parts to this video coming, and they're really deep. This video was simply to discuss the slave trade. So, you know what? Before I end this video, let's keep it going. You know, I'm in a good mood today, so let's keep it going. The slave trade. So we've already discussed that Africans were not completely brought over here by the slave trade. The majority of Africans were here already and enslaved afterwards as free people. So, my message to the African American, the reality is that the African American is not a natural species of human on this earth. All right? I just have to break it to you. My black folk, my African American people, right? When I say you are not a naturally occurring species of human, what I mean is that the human mind orchestrated activities in order to create the person that you are. The African American is not what nature created. The African American is what the European slave master created, right? The African American, how do you create an African American? Well, in order to create an African American, you have to take African DNA, you have to take Caucasian DNA, but not necessarily Caucasian DNA. You have to take African DNA, and you have to selectively breed it for the purpose for which that you want the offspring to perform, right? So if picking cotton on the slave field or carrying heavy loads is the role that you want this offspring to perform, you're going to make sure that the breeding process includes some people of size and substance to be able to handle that job. People who have the energy levels to be motivated to handle that job and do it well. Similar to what they do with purebred dogs. Golden retrievers have been bred, selectively bred, specifically to have the drive to chase, fetch, and retrieve. Meaning that you can throw a ball to a golden retriever all day, it'll never stop, get tired of playing fetch, right? It's its blood, it's not the dog. You can't play fetch with a pit bull and think that you're gonna have a great time because they're just not bred for that, okay? So, the African American was created. It was created through many different lines, right? So there were the big oxmen that were created. There were the high yellows, the light skins, the brown skins, the good hairs, and all of those were created through selective breeding. Some selective breeding included injecting European Caucasian DNA into African DNA, commingling in it and creating hybrids or chimeras that we now know as the African American, okay? So the African American is not a natural race of people, right? The reason why I say that is because I want to make it clear that I'm not being racist. I'm on both sides of this conversation. The African American is not one of the original races of the earth. That goes also for Hispanic people. Hispanic people are not of the original races of the earth, right? That goes also for white people. All white people. There is not a white person, a European, a Caucasian, that is of the original DNA or the original races of this earth. Okay? The reality is, as I've broken down to create a African American, I'm gonna have to break it down for the other races in order to let you know how we create these sub-races to the original races. So before I do that, let me let you know what the original races are. You have, well, what the total races are, right? We don't have many original races, but what are the total races on the earth? There is the African race. There is the Caucasian race. There is the Asian race. There is the Native American race, and there is the the Pacific Islander race, right? So Pacific Islander would be like your Hawaiian, Hawaiians, and those people over there in the Bikini Islands and all of that, Samoans and all that type of stuff. All right. So those are the races of the earth, true races of the earth. Every other peoples of the earth, if you have not been mentioned in one of those categories, is because it takes those categories to create your race. It's almost like primary colors. Red, blue, and yellow are the primary colors. If your color hasn't been mentioned in that, is because it takes red and blue, blue or yellow and red to make the color that you like, right? Same thing with the races. So the white race is not an original race, and the Hispanic race is not an original race. We're back to that. Well, we said to create the African American, which is also not an original race, it's a sub-race, that we had to selectively breed Africans for work purposes, right? And not only work purposes were Africans bred for, but also control and separation purposes, division purposes, the purpose of division. The African is the only race of people, the African American is the only race of people that was created with intent, right? Every other subculture of people was created through Darwinism and evolution, right? The African American was created with intent, meaning that someone specifically said, we're gonna mix these people and those people together in order to create this result. The only people on the earth that has happened with. Okay. How do you create a Hispanic person? Well, you get a Taino Indian, right? You mix them with a European Spaniard, right? And you get what we call Hispanic. Now, the variation of the mixture, the levels of the mixture over time, location and residence gives you the different cultures in the Hispanic, under the Hispanic umbrella. So whether you're Puerto Rican, Mexican, Guatemalan, whatever, that is determined by the mixture of the original ingredients. So whether you take a Native American, a heavy Native American, and a person with light European DNA, or you take multiple generations of Native American and one entry of white DNA, or multiple generations of European DNA and one entry of Native American DNA, that'll give you the variation in the Hispanic race. And also, before I go any further, I would like to say that the base race in all races on the earth is the African. So, I might forget to say it like I just did with the Hispanic, but I will swing back around and let you know. In order to make a Hispanic, you need African DNA, European Caucasian DNA, and Native American DNA. Okay? Now, some people are double dipped African. What do I mean by double dipped African? What I mean is that all people on the earth are of African DNA because that's where all life was created. However, as the peoples of the earth separated and grew away from each other, if they dipped back in, which means reproduced again later on in the gene pool with an African, that would be double dipping African, multiple dipping African, multiple different Caucasian and all that. But it's a lot more noticeable clearly when the double dipping of the African occurs in the DNA. That's because of dominant recessive genes, but again, we'll have that conversation later. So, how do we create the Hispanic? The African, mixed with the Caucasian Spaniard, European, mixed with the Native American, creates the Hispanic. Okay. How do we create the white race? If I've said the white race is not an original race on this planet, how do we create them? And this is where it gets real touchy, real scary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the answer to that question for the next part of this video. Tune in, like, subscribe. Next video starts off with how do you create the white race? Thank you.